David Carter stepped out of his sleek, black car and into the crisp morning air. He had built his empire from the ground up, one brick at a time, one sale at a time. The dealership in front of him was the crown jewel of his hard work. This was where it all started, where his dream became a reality. Yet, as he looked up at the tall glass building, his heart weighed a little heavier than usual. He ran his fingers through his neatly trimmed beard, adjusting the sleeves of his simple gray hoodie, and took a deep breath. It had been years since he'd walked into one of his own dealerships as just another customer. He didn't have to do this. He didn't need to see this firsthand. But something told him that, after all these years of success, it was time for a reality check. Time to see if the values he built his company on, respect, fairness, and service, were still being upheld. The showroom gleamed under the soft glow of overhead lighting. Cars, luxury vehicles of every make and model, were displayed with almost artistic precision. The polished floors reflected the shine of chrome, creating a beautiful, almost unreal image of wealth and success. Yet David felt a subtle tension in the air, an unease that tugged at him as he stepped inside. He glanced around. Salespeople in perfectly tailored suits mingled near the coffee station, chatting among themselves. Some of them were busy with customers, their voices enthusiastic, eager to make a sale. He noted every detail. The showroom was immaculate, as it always had been. But something was different. Something felt off. David walked toward a black sports car, admiring its sleek curves and polished finish. It was the kind of vehicle that turned heads, even among the high-end models. He ran his hand over the smooth hood, expecting the usual greeting from a salesperson. A smile, a handshake, a quick inquiry about his interest. But nothing came. He waited, letting the silence stretch, but still, no one approached him. He turned his head, meeting the gaze of a tall, middle-aged man with slicked-back hair and a name tag that read Greg. Greg's eyes met his for the briefest of moments before quickly darting away. The man looked back down at his phone, clearly disinterested. David paused, his curiosity piqued. He had been dismissed before, but in his own dealership? This was new. Still, he kept his composure. He wasn't here to make waves, not yet. He wanted to see just how deep the rot ran. A few moments later, a younger salesman, probably in his mid-20s, walked right past him. David gave him a polite nod, but the young man didn't even notice. He headed straight for another customer, a well-dressed man in a navy blue suit. "Sir, welcome. Can I help you find something today?" the young man said with a smile that oozed warmth and enthusiasm. David raised an eyebrow. He had just been ignored again, blatantly. But he remained calm. He wasn't about to make a scene, not yet. He wanted to observe, to understand. As David lingered by the sleek black car, he overheard a conversation from the front desk. Two salesmen, leaning casually against the counter, were laughing and talking in low voices. "That guy," one of them sneered, gesturing in David's direction. "Not worth the time. He's probably just here to take pictures for his dream board or something." David's jaw clenched. He had heard enough. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. His patience was wearing thin, but he wasn't here to be treated like an outsider. He wasn't here to be dismissed. He walked purposefully toward the front desk, where Greg and Jake, the younger salesmen, were still standing, chatting away as though they owned the place. As soon as David approached, their conversation stopped. Their eyes shifted nervously as David took a step forward. "Excuse me," David said, his voice firm but polite. "I'm interested in the black sports car over there." He pointed toward the vehicle he had admired moments before. Jake, who had been busy texting on his phone, barely spared him a glance. "You want to handle this?" Jake muttered, directing the question toward Greg. Greg shrugged nonchalantly. "Nah, man. Not worth my time. He probably can't even afford a down payment." David's patience had run out. It wasn't about the car anymore. It was about respect. He wasn't here to be humiliated. He wasn't here to be looked down upon in his own showroom. "Actually," David said, his tone ice cold now, "I'd like to take it for a test drive. Can we arrange that?" Greg rolled his eyes and crossed his arms, taking a long, slow look at David's simple hoodie and sneakers. Test drives are for serious buyers, sir. This car starts at over 100 grand. You sure you're in the right place? David's gaze didn't waver. His voice dropped to a low, controlled pitch. And what makes you think I'm not serious? Greg's confidence faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained it. He looked David up and down again. I don't want to waste your time or mine, Greg said, dismissively. You're probably just here to dream. David stepped forward, his jaw tight with barely suppressed anger. But he wasn't here to fight. Not yet. Actually, he said, pulling out his phone and dialing a number. I'm going to prove you wrong. He held the phone to his ear, never breaking eye contact with Greg. The line rang once before Mark, his regional manager, picked up. Hey Mark, David said smoothly. I'm at the downtown showroom. I've just had an interesting experience trying to buy a car. Mark's voice shifted immediately, now paying full attention. Which dealership are you at? This one, David said. And I've been completely dismissed by two of your employees, Greg and Jake. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Mark, clearly on edge now, responded cautiously. Wait, what? I'll be right there. David didn't answer him. Instead, he turned his gaze back to Greg, whose smirk had started to falter. You might want to check your employee roster, David said, his voice calm but with a bite of steel in it. My name is David Carter, CEO and founder of this company. For a moment, Greg just stared at him, the color draining from his face. David watched as realization sank in. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Mark's voice came through the phone, now filled with urgency. I'm on my way. Hold tight. David didn't respond to Mark. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on Greg. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after all of this. He had seen everything he needed to see. Greg, now flustered and desperate, tried to recover. Sir, I didn't realize. His voice was shaky now. David raised a hand, cutting him off. No need to apologize. I've heard everything I need to. Your attitude speaks volumes. The showroom had fallen deathly silent. Employees had stopped what they were doing, turning their attention toward the unfolding scene. Customers stood frozen, eyes darting between David, Greg, and the now silent salesman. Mark arrived a few moments later, his face set in a grim expression. He took one look at the situation and quickly assessed the tension in the room. David, what's going on here? Mark asked, his voice cautious. David turned to him slowly. Mark, I walked in here today looking to make a purchase, and instead of being treated like a customer, I was treated like an outsider. I stood there, ignored, dismissed, and belittled. Mark shifted his gaze toward Greg and Jake. What's going on with you two? David's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced down to see a text from Mark. We need to talk. The team is in chaos after what happened today. When you have time, give me a call. David's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but he kept his focus on the road. He needed to clear his head before diving into this. The last thing he wanted was to come down too hard, too fast. But the reality was that his company was broken in places he hadn't realized. People who should have been following his example, living out his values, were instead playing power games, judging customers before they even walked through the door. And then there was Sarah, the one bright spot in the entire ordeal. She had treated him like a person, not a potential sale, and that had made all the difference. He couldn't let that go unnoticed. She deserved to be rewarded, recognized, and, most importantly, given the opportunity to help reshape the culture at his dealership. As David drove, the city passed by in a blur. He thought about the kind of leadership he had always tried to maintain. He had always been a hands-on CEO, involved in every level of his business. But somewhere along the way, the people he had trusted to manage his dealerships had lost sight of what mattered. And today had been a wake-up call. A painful one, but a necessary one. It wasn't just about the employees. It was about the customers, too. How many people had walked into that dealership and been dismissed without even being given a chance? How many potential sales had been lost because of assumptions made based on someone's appearance, their clothes, their demeanor? David had seen firsthand how harmful that mentality could be, and he had been guilty of allowing it to go unchecked. He pulled into the parking garage of his building, parked his car, and sat there for a moment, collecting his thoughts. The buzz of the city outside faded into the background as he exhaled slowly, staring at the steering wheel. The time for waiting, for ignoring the cracks in his company, was over. He needed to make sweeping changes, fast. David stepped out of the car and walked toward the elevator. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call from Mark. He answered quickly. "David," Mark said, his voice a little strained. "We've got a problem. The team is, well, let's just say they're rattled. After the scene with Greg and Jake, the whole dealership is on edge. I've been getting calls from HR, from upper management. People are worried about the fallout." David's jaw clenched. "I'm not worried about the fallout, Mark. I'm worried about what's been happening under our noses for too long. How long have we been letting people like Greg and Jake run the show?" Mark didn't answer right away. David could hear the hesitation in his voice. "It's been happening for a while, David. We've all seen it, but no one wanted to address it. It's easier to just ignore it and keep things running smoothly." David's frustration bubbled to the surface. "That's the problem, Mark. We've been so focused on keeping the wheels turning that we've let the culture erode. We've let arrogance and entitlement creep in. It's time to fix that." "I agree," Mark said quickly, "but we need to tread carefully. There's a lot of resistance here. People are afraid of change." David didn't want to hear that. He didn't care about resistance. Resistance could be broken, but complacency, that had to be uprooted. "You can't fix a culture by tiptoeing around it," David said sharply. "I'm coming in tomorrow. I'm going to sit down with the whole team and we'll address this head-on. But I need you to start with a full review of all the sales staff. I want to know who's been upholding the standards and who's been taking shortcuts. And I want this done quickly. We'll start with Greg and Jake. But I need to know where the rot goes deeper." Mark's voice faltered. "Understood. But David, I have to ask, what about Sarah? She was the only one who did the right thing. I mean, she showed you respect when no one else did." David smiled, though his thoughts were heavy. "Sarah's been promoted. She's going to help lead the change we need to see. She did exactly what we should expect from every employee in this company. She treated me like a human being. That's what I want the culture here to reflect." Mark paused. "You're promoting her? Just like that?" David's tone softened, but there was still steel in it. "Yes, Mark. She's the kind of employee we need more of. She gets it. It's the others who don't. I'll make sure she has the resources to step up and help me shift things here." As he entered his office, David walked past the team members who worked on the floor of the building. Their eyes lingered on him, some curious, some anxious. He knew they were all wondering how the fallout from today's events would unfold. He couldn't afford to show any weakness. His company's reputation was on the line. More than that, he was staking his own legacy on making things right. He sat at his desk and tapped a few keys on his computer. The next steps were clear. First, he needed to meet with Mark and the HR department to get a full understanding of the situation. Then, he would start laying the groundwork for a training overhaul, a re-education of what customer service, respect, and leadership really meant. No more shortcuts. No more assumptions. David looked out the window of his office, his thoughts focused and sharp. He had built this empire, but it wasn't enough just to run a successful business. He wanted to build a place where every customer was treated with respect, no matter their background. A place where employees understood that their success was directly tied to the success of those who walked through the doors. Tomorrow, everything would change. But for now, he had work to do. The next morning arrived with a sense of urgency. David had barely slept, his mind racing with ideas, strategies, and decisions he needed to make. He had spent years building his business, but he hadn't realized until the day before just how far some of the foundational values had crumbled. The reality hit him hard. This wasn't just a few rogue employees misbehaving. This was a systemic issue, an issue that had spread quietly through the ranks, poisoning the company culture. Now, it was time to set things right. David arrived at the dealership early, well before most of the staff had even clocked in. The streets were quiet, and the sun had just started to peek over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the glassy surface of the showroom. As he walked into the building, he took a moment to absorb the space. This was his empire, built from scratch. The polished floors, the shiny cars on display, the gleaming walls. But the emptiness in the air spoke volumes. He wasn't just walking into his dealership. He was walking into the heart of a problem that had to be solved before it spread any further. His phone buzzed, and it was Mark, already there and waiting. "Morning, David. You ready for this?" Mark's voice sounded both anxious and determined, a reflection of the tense atmosphere David knew was waiting for him. David exhaled, his tone calm but resolute. "I've been ready for this since yesterday. Let's make it right." He walked into the main showroom, where he could already see a few employees filtering in. Most of them looked uncomfortable, stealing quick glances at each other, at the cars, at their phones. They weren't ready for what was coming, and David wasn't about to sugarcoat it. This wasn't a quick fix. This was a reset. Mark was standing near the front desk, waiting for him. David gave him a short nod and then moved to stand in front of the large glass doors that separated the showroom from the offices. He could see everyone starting to filter in, the team that would be held accountable today. As the employees filled the room, David could feel the weight of the moment. They were all here whether they liked it or not, and it was time for them to hear the truth. "Everyone, take a seat," David said firmly, his voice echoing through the showroom. His tone was steady, authoritative. There was no room for hesitation now. The staff, mostly in their 20s and 30s, turned toward him, their faces a mix of confusion, curiosity, and nervousness. Even Greg and Jake, now sitting in the back with their heads lowered, looked like men who knew their time had come. David waited for everyone to settle before speaking again, his gaze sweeping over the group. "I'm not here to lecture. I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I'm here because we've lost our way. You've all been part of this company for a reason. You were hired because we believed in you, because we believed you could uphold the values that built this business. But somewhere along the way, those values were forgotten." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. No one spoke. No one even moved. David's gaze locked with Greg's and Jake's. "I saw it with my own eyes yesterday. The arrogance, the assumptions, the disrespect. I walked into this dealership, and I was treated like an outsider in my own business. And when I say I was treated like an outsider, I'm not just talking about the way I was ignored. I'm talking about how I was dismissed because of what I looked like, because of what I was wearing, because someone assumed I wasn't worthy of their time. That's the problem. It's not about making a sale. It's about respecting people. It's about treating everyone who walks through that door as a potential customer. No one should ever be made to feel less than, especially not in my company." Greg, who had been sitting stiffly with his arms crossed, opened his mouth to speak, but David raised a hand. "You don't need to explain yourself, Greg. I heard everything you said, and it's not just about you. It's about every person here who's been taking shortcuts. It's about every person who's been making assumptions about customers, about each other, about what this company stands for. That stops now." He turned his attention to the rest of the team. "And it's not just about you two. This isn't an isolated issue. How many of you have been following these examples consciously or unconsciously? How many of you have dismissed customers based on their appearance? How many of you have acted entitled, like the sales were owed to you? I want to hear it." A heavy silence fell over the room. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. It was as if David had just forced them to confront their own complicity. His heart was pounding in his chest, not with anger, but with the weight of the realization. They were all a part of this, but they could also be the solution. Mark, who had been standing off to the side, cleared his throat. "David's right. This has gone on long enough, and I know we've all been guilty of letting things slide. But we can't move forward until we address the truth about where we've gone wrong." David's eyes softened, just for a moment. "Look, I know we've all made mistakes. I've made mistakes too. But we can't keep doing business the same way. I want every single one of you to remember why you started here, why you joined this company. If you don't remember that, you're not just doing a disservice to me. You're doing a disservice to yourselves and to every customer who walks through those doors. The room was silent again. It was as if the weight of his words had finally hit home. David could see the discomfort in their eyes, the understanding beginning to settle in. They knew what had to happen next. So, David said, leaning forward, his tone shifting to something more strategic. Here's what we're going to do. Effective immediately, we're launching a new training program. We're going to revisit every core value this company was built on. We'll be focusing on customer service, respect, and diversity. We're going to make sure that everyone who works here knows how to treat our customers with the dignity and respect they deserve. If you're not willing to commit to that, if you're not willing to change the way you think about this business and our customers, then you need to walk out that door now. David's eyes scanned the room, waiting for someone to speak, to make a move. But there was no response. No one left. They were all still there, sitting quietly, their eyes trained on him. I don't want to lose anyone who's committed to this change. But I'm also not afraid to let people go who aren't willing to adapt. The choice is yours. It's time to decide. Are you part of the problem or part of the solution? He gave them a moment to absorb everything. And then, with a final nod, he stood tall. Mark, you've got the floor, David said, stepping back slightly to give Mark the opportunity to take over the next phase of the meeting. Mark nodded and stepped forward, his expression more determined now. We're going to start from the top down, Mark said. David and I have made it clear what needs to change. We'll begin a comprehensive review of every staff member's performance, and we'll be putting every single employee through retraining. Sarah, you'll be working closely with me on this. You've already shown us how it's done, and we need more of that. Sarah, who had been standing quietly in the back, nodded gratefully. She could hardly believe it. Just yesterday, she had been a new hire, just doing her job. Now, she was going to help lead the charge in shaping the future of the dealership. As the meeting continued, David remained quiet, watching as Mark and the team laid out the plans for the new training program. He knew there was still work to do. This was only the beginning. But something had shifted in the room. The air was different now. The employees who had once sat with their heads down were now looking at each other with renewed determination. David knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more resistance, more hurdles to overcome. But he was ready. He had built this company to last, and he was going to make sure it stayed true to the values that had gotten it to the top in the first place. It was time to reset, time to rebuild.